Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan has told Parliament that Eskom has spent a cumulative 65 billion rand on diesel over the last 5 years. The power utility has been using diesel as it fights to keep the lights on to minimise load shedding. He said Eskom has increasingly relied on diesel to power its open-cycle gas turbines, OCGTs, to plug the electricity generation gap. The utility heavily relies on its OCGTs, some of its most reliable power stations, to reduce the stages of load shedding implemented. This comes as the country has now gone over a month without power cuts. Joining me now is energy analyst at Clyde Mallinson. Clyde, very good afternoon. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, afternoon, Hugo.
Happy Freedom Day.
Yeah, same to you. Happy Freedom Month. Freedom Month from load shedding.
It's obviously a good thing to celebrate, but are we really free from the throes of load shedding? It's been almost 30 days without load shedding.
Yes. I think what one needs to do is look at it in perspective. So last year we had our worst load shedding average ever. But on average, we were only short of about 1.8 gigawatts, which is 1,800 megawatts, which is kind of 2 stages of load shedding on average. But of course, sometimes we had 0, sometimes we had 6, so that's what average means. This year, our demand has dropped by 1.4 gigawatts. So we only have to make up, if you like, 0.4 gigawatts compared to last year. So that's the first point. And the reason our load has dropped by about 1.4 is a combination of reduced usage by energy-intensive users. So we will have seen some of the retrenchments at the platinum mines, for example. But the other major factor is the increase in rooftop solar that's been put on.
So it must suggest that it's been a massive increase. Rapid increase.
Well,
too.
There's been a rapid increase, and it's obviously much bigger in the daytime because we're talking solar. But on average, the solar is probably adding about, accounting for about 1 of the 1.4 gigawatts of reduction we've had this year. So combination of reduced load, and then to be fair, the Eskom coal fleet is showing better performance than it did last year. So that closes that gap, if you like, and that's why we're having no load shedding at the moment.
So how much do we attribute to the appointment of the electricity minister?
Look, he's been working very hard at getting this to improve, and I think we can definitely attribute a portion of it to the minister, but not all of it. If we'd still had one must remember that 3 units from Kusile were not working last year. So at the beginning of last year, the same period we're looking at for this year, we were missing about 2 gigawatts of power from Kusile, and that 2 gigawatts has come back now. And in addition, we've had a reduction in 1.5. That's 3.5. And remember, last year, the average was only 1.8. So we kind of doubled the average of extra ammunition, if you like. So I'm actually not surprised that we're in a lull at the moment of load shedding. The important thing, though, and sorry, it looks a bit like the old Prime Minister. The important thing, though, is that we should use this hiatus in load shedding to quadruple our efforts to put new generation capacity in. Because the only way you can counter this long term is to put new generation capacity in so that the coal fleet can be decommissioned according to schedule. And I always like to say so that it can be decommissioned in a planned, dignified fashion. A bit like having a funeral plan, if you know what I mean.
So I'm going to come back to the coal fleet.
Yes.
Right. And that's obviously because some nations in the West are still using coal. They're still buying our coal from Africa, but are pushing for us to go to renewable energy. But what I'd like to do is to have you put 65 billion rand that's been spent on diesel in the last 5 years into context. If that 65 billion rand had been used to a permanent solution that wasn't diesel, just how much permanency would it have brought us?
Well, I'm going to change your question slightly, if you don't mind. So first of all, the 65 billion that was referred to was the money that Eskom spent on its own diesel OCGTs, open cycle gas turbines. They spent another 50% on average on independent power producer open cycle gas turbines. So in the figures in the report you sent me that said last year Eskom spent 24 billion of that 65 on diesel. The actual figure was closer to 36 billion.
So we're looking at about 100 billion in total.
We're looking at about 100 billion rather than the 65. So if we just dial back and look at last year was a poor year for diesel. We spent 35 billion on diesel just in the 1 year. That's the Eskom diesel and the IPP diesel. Now, if we had spent that amount of money, or if Eskom had spent that amount of money on installing solar, if Eskom had spent 35 billion installing Eskom-owned solar, which they're not allowed to do, by the way, because they're not allowed to spend money on capital. And diesel's obviously not capital, it's a running expense. But had they done that, the quantity of solar they could have bought would have produced as much electricity in a year as what the 35 billion spent on running diesel did. But of course it would do it the next year and the next year and the next year and the next year for 25 years. So that's the thing that hurts, if you like. And remember, the diesel OCGTs are meant to be used only as emergency resources, or put it another way, our load profile is not constant. We all know we peak in the early evening, especially in winter on a cold night. And it's that peak where Eskom literally don't have enough fleet to fill the demand. And that's when the OCGTs are meant to be fired up, as well as when the pump storage is meant to be fired up to fill that demand gap at peak time. Now, most of last year, the OCGTs were running in that peak demand period, but here's the problem. They were actually running 24/7 for most of the year. They were even running at night in order to fill the pump storage, so that when the daytime peak came the next day, you could hit it with OCGTs and pump storage. But of course, if you let water out of your pump storage, you've got to put it back again. So we were running OCGTs at night and having load shedding at night in order to create a pseudo surplus, which we could use to replenish the pump storage. And that was never the intention of those OCGTs. They're meant to run for about 3 to 4% of the time, of the time. Last year, the Eskom and the IPP OCGTs ran for somewhere between 17 and 18%. And you can see, if you're running 5-6 times as much, you take your budget that used to be 6 billion, times it by 6, and you've got your 30 billion.
And obviously 100 billion over the 5 years.
Yes.
All right, so Dan Morekane is now substantive CEO of Eskom.
Yes.
He's talked about around stage 2 load shedding during winter, and top end stage 5, and likely to touch stage 6. Just how much of a reality is this?
I think he's probably correct. You know, Eskom at the moment seem to be able to stump up about 25 gigawatts with their coal fleet, with Coburg and with Cahora Bassa, and with some hydro at Garep and Van der Kloof. They're running at about 25 at the moment in the daytime. So when we need 28 at peak time, that's when they bring in the OCGTs and the pump storage, because collectively the OCGTs and the pump storage can produce close to 6, not quite 6. So you can see if you're doing 25, you're kind of covered. Right, now in winter, traditionally we go up to 33 sometimes. So now you can see if we're 25 plus the 6, we're 31, there's the 2. But the problem comes in, we can't run the OCGTs at full throttle at peak time and the open cycle, and the pump storage at full throttle at peak time. And the reason you can't run both of them simultaneously at full throttle is you need to keep some in reserve. In case there's a snapped conveyor belt at Medupi or something, there's got to be a reserve margin. So when I say that the OCGT fleet and the Eskom pump storage fleet can deliver 5.7, it actually can't deliver more than about 3.5, because it's got to keep 2.2 as it's a bit like a reserve tank on a motorcycle. I don't know if you've ever had a motorcycle with that little reserve tank. when you're on the reserve tank, you can't call it a reserve anymore. When that one's empty, it's empty. Yeah. So that's the story.
So let's touch on alignment as far as Eskom's plans for renewable energy are concerned. And obviously the issue of fossil fuels. We talked about coal a little while ago, which is, I mean, as you say, the coal is performing at the moment. The coal stations are performing at the moment. Is it in alignment with what the global north expects?
No, I think, look, at the moment, the coal fleet is performing marginally better than it was last year, but it's still suffering. About 30% of its capacity is broken in unplanned maintenance, and about 10% of its capacity is in planned maintenance. The other thing I forgot to mention why we're having a hiatus in load shedding is that Eskom generally take their foot off the pedal of planned maintenance as we move into the winter months. It's done intentionally. They do more planned maintenance in summer and less in winter. It looks to me as if they've taken the foot off the planned maintenance pedal a little bit earlier this year, because our energy availability factor is climbing in parallel to the way it did last year, but it's about 8 weeks earlier. And so one could argue that they've taken the foot off the planned maintenance pedal a little bit earlier, perhaps to mitigate against load shedding over the next 2 months.
So when we look at investment, foreign direct investment, just how much of the non-availability of regular power impacts decisions by key investors to come into this economy?
There's only one way to look at the macroeconomic impacts of load shedding. It's difficult to put a number on the cost of unserved energy. There is a number, and it's around about 100 Rand a kilowatt hour. But it's not an easy number to relate to, because, I mean, electricity, as we know, costs about 1.50 Rand, 2 Rand a kilowatt hour. So when you're talking 100 Rand a kilowatt hour, what I like to do is look at the cumulative impact on our GDP and on our country. And I would argue that our GDP growth has been at least 1% lower than it should have been since we started experiencing load shedding. And if you speak to any economists, they'll probably say, well, that sounds a bit conservative. Surely it's more than just 1% impact. You know, and we're talking now about direct impact on our economy and indirectly new foreign direct investment. Someone wanting to come and open a ferrochrome smelter in the last 14 years, Eskom would have said, sorry, we can't guarantee that we can supply you with electricity. So they said, okay, well, we won't do it, as an example. Now, if you take 1 or a little bit over 1% for, what is it now? It's probably 17 years, 2008 to 16 years. If you take a little bit over 1% for 16 years and you do that cumulatively, I would argue that our GDP in real terms is 20% lower today than it should be due to load shedding. And 20% lower is about $100 billion. But it's not just this year that it's $100 billion lower. We're $100 billion behind where we should be. And it's next year we're 100. So it's had a devastating impact on our economy. And you know, that's 20% of our GDP growth. So we have to catch up now in order to get to where we should be. We've got to grow to catch up the missing 20% and then still grow on top of that. And you know, it's not difficult to understand then why we have this blight of unemployment and reducing quality of life, basically, and a reducing ability to pay the bills, pay for the electricity, pay for the water. We're in a tight spot economically.
Clyde, finally, you know, when we talk about the impact of load shedding, the biggest conversations, the most common conversations are the impact that it has on business. But let's talk about households and also talk about the cost of electricity. Right. One of the things that I was reading up on yesterday is that many people are now using credit to pay for household consumption. But in the same breath, there's also a growing number of individuals that are having to forego electricity because if it runs out to the meter and this is what they've budgeted, they're not able to pay anymore. But what it does, sorry, before you come in, is that then all these young students and these learners, these matriculants, all those in university that are preparing for examinations and basically have to study in the dark, under candlelight or...
Yeah. We're now in the unenviable position where we have 14 million homes connected to electricity of the 17 million. And of those 14 million, 11 million live in energy poverty, which basically means they can't afford a minimum poverty level of electricity. And they're having to make daily decisions. Should we keep the electricity on or should we put food on the table? 11 million live in energy poverty, and that is our biggest problem. If we're looking to solve our electricity problem and we do it without solving the affordability problem, then we haven't solved anything. We need to, and there are solutions. Thankfully, there are solutions, but we need to embrace those solutions in order to lift those 11 million households out of energy poverty.